So welcome, Dr. Michael Beyhi. We're very happy to have you again for the second time. Last time we talked about very important points with regards to your book, with regards to evolution in general. So in the beginning, I would like to introduce you to all the audience here. Dr. Michael Beyhi is a biochemist. He's an intelligent design advocate and an author of Darwin's Black Box and Edge of Evolution. He's a professor of biochemistry at Leigh University and a founding senior fellow of Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. His recent book is Darwin Devolves. So we would like to start, Dr. Michael, a question that comes to mind. Some people, they understand the word evolution in different ways. It's a general term. So for people, it can be equal to Darwinism. And for others, it can be like change over time, while some others perceive evolution as simply common descent. So if we ask Professor Beyhi what his definition of evolution, what would it be?
Well, my definition of evolution would be change over time. Okay, that's what I would call generic evolution or plain evolution. And it's interesting because some scientists before Darwin had proposed that life on Earth descended from earlier forms of life. But they always proposed that it was done on purpose, that it was directed by God or by some law of nature or something. Darwin's claim to fame was not just that he proposed evolution, but he proposed a mechanism, a completely natural, non-intelligent mechanism to say how life might have developed. And that's exactly what intelligent design as a movement focuses on, Darwin's mechanism. That is, can the development of creatures, fantastic creatures like whales and bats and so on, have happened by unintelligent processes or not. And so evolution, in my sense, I just call that common descent. And if we're talking about Darwin's mechanism, I call that Darwinism.
So that means that the point of trying to match Darwinism with like the belief in God, it's like sort of like an oxymoron, because Darwin is trying to propose a new suggestion here that random, let's say he didn't know about mutation maybe at his time, so random changes by natural selection working on the changes of the different species. So that this randomness, we would like to also touch upon, is it until the moment by the evidence of science that it's really random?
No, is the word. You can't prove that something is random because it might be part of a very complex scheme that you just can't figure out from our limited perspective. One can see that mutations seem to arise as if they were random, but that's all you can say, as if. And so if you think that there is some guidance behind them, and then that would be very, very, very difficult to distinguish from what you'd expect for random.
So what about, like, Dr. Beyhi, with regards to this point that we heard in some of your discussions, that you don't have, like, you can say, a clear thought or a clear opinion about universal descent, about all creatures and all species and so on. So what do you think about that? Is there any proof for this? Do you think that the proof for common descent is there in the literature, and anyone who denies that is non-scientific?
No, I don't think there's proof. If you mean it in the sense that it's undeniable, given this evidence, it's undeniable. No, people see the similarities between creatures, and they say to themselves, well, if these creatures had descended from some earlier one that had these features, then it would explain why they have them now. So For example, all vertebrates, have pentadactyl limbs, and Darwin said that, well, if it had been inherited from a common ancestor, that would explain it. But that's kind of begging the question, such as where did it come from in the first place? And evolution is not a theory of, what things are similar to each other. It's supposed to be a theory of transformation. How did this ancestor give rise to, horses and foxes and whales and bats and so on? And so that has very, very little to say to it. So it's a difficult question.
So what about that we share 99% of the DNA with the apes? So how can we respond to that?
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, people say, well, we have 99% similarity between apes and us. So what does that mean? Well, you can say a number of things about that. The first is that if that's the case, then it's a very poor measure of the similarity between species, because any child can tell easily the difference between a human and a ape or a chimpanzee or some such thing. Second thing to say is that suppose it were 99% similarity. That means there's 1% difference, and there are 3 billion units in human DNA. 1% of 3 billion is 30 million. That means there are 30 million differences between us and these primates. So it emphasizes the similarities, but there's an enormous number of differences. The final thing you can say is that even if that's 99%, so what? We still have to understand how in the world can an accidental process give rise to humans, humans that have minds and have dominated the planet and so on. So, it's an interesting number, but it doesn't really speak to the main question.
So what about the studies, like Dr. Behe, that went through the genome of the apes and the genome of human beings, and they actually chose like 2/3 of the genome to compare, and they cut off like 26% of the ape's genome and about 16 or 20% of the human beings. So this is, like, we can say, cherry picking. They are just choosing certain parts of the genome, not all, and they explain away the differences between the genome of the human beings and the apes. So how can we say about this? Is this like credibility about the scientific research? Why aren't they telling the masses about that when they say that we share 99% of apes?
Well, probably for a couple reasons. First, they probably think it's reasonable. The other pieces they make up excuses for, that these aren't exactly coinciding with the DNA of the apes, but since they believe in common descent already, it doesn't strike them as a big deal. Additionally, they don't mention these problems when they speak to the public, because they are suspicious of the public. They want the public to follow their way of thinking. They're not just anxious to tell you the latest results. They want you to think like them. They don't want you to have a view where maybe God or something outside nature affects it directly. They want you to think that the only thing in nature is matter and energy and chance and so on. And so they will not point out problems for questions about evolution very easily.
And is it, Dr. B, because of we have similarities with other creatures, like let's say the rat. We have like 92% according to the research, even the evolutionists or the Darwinists, and they don't really focus on that too much. And maybe it's because it's going to give the indication that don't rely so much on what we match with other animals, as they say, like the famous joke that we are halfway banana, like 50% of our genes like match the needs of the banana.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, the 99% is an interesting number about humans versus apes, but as you say, we share a lot of DNA with all creatures, and you're not going to get many people to be persuaded that you're 50% banana, as you point out. So there's an American author named Mark Twain who once said that, you know, there are three kinds of lies, you know, terrible lies, and statistics. And statistics, such as the 99% and so on, they can mislead in many ways, and they're useful sometimes, but these just comparisons of numbers don't really do as much as the evolutionists would want them to do.
So we can say, like, summarize this by saying it's oversimplification. You're oversimplifying things here.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, it's interesting. You shouldn't ignore it, but they're trying to make too much out of it and overlook all the complexity that is there as well.
So what's the role of the layman? Like a person like me, I'm not a specialist. How can he know what this scientist is saying is the truth, or he's just backing his ideology? What is the standard that he can use here?
Well, that's a very difficult question. It's difficult for lay people to know that, but you should just keep in the back of your mind that as the question that's being discussed by a scientist or in science books, as it increases in importance for our personal lives and for our governments and other things too, there's more and more of a temptation for scientists to insert their own ideas about what the evidence should show. So the more important the question, the more you have to be wary. If somebody is just researching how to treat cancer or diseases and so on, it's very important, but it's doesn't have philosophical implications. So you can pretty much trust people with that. When the topic is important, when it has political or philosophical or religious implications, then you have to be really very skeptical, very demand real evidence that you can see and understand the basis for what science is trying to claim.
What are the political differences that can happen, or let's say, what are the political ideologies that can be backed by Darwinism?
Oh, pretty much anything. Anything can be backed by Darwinism, because Darwinism has no political or philosophical or any content. It's kind of a nihilistic idea that there is just chance and things happen, and so there. And in the United States, there have been a number of books published that talk about, how Darwinism supports political liberalism, and another book about how Darwinism actually supports political conservatism, and how Darwinism supports, crimes, breaking the law, and how Darwinism supports, respect for the law. You can make it do anything you want. It's very flexible. But even some people talk about how Darwinian processes would be just the perfect way for God to make life. If he wants our advice, they say, he should use Darwinian process.
Yes.
So it's so vacuous, so empty of real, real content that you can use it for any purpose.
That's amazing. You reminded me of what Richard Dawkins said, and he's like a strong advocate of new atheism and Darwinism. And he said that it's a terrible way of living to live by the standards of Darwinism. Yes, I'm very strong to support the theory, but to live by it, oh no, it's going to be something really ferocious.
Yeah, and that's crazy because he thinks that's all there is. You know, with how is he not going to live by Darwinism? He thinks that's what is responsible for all of life. Where does he get the ability to not, you know, live by Darwinian principles?
You have to revolt against your genes. He says this. You have to revolt against them. You have to rebel against them.
That's right. Well, but it's your genes that are telling you to revolt against your genes. You know, he has to say. He doesn't believe in a mind, an independent mind, or let alone a soul. So he has nothing but his genes to cause him to say things.
So, Dr. Beyhi, we heard that you mentioned in your book that what changed your view on Darwinism was evolution in crisis, theory in crisis, by Michael Denton.
Right.
This book highlighted the abrupt appearance of unique body plans without any evolutionary path during the Cambrian explosion. So, does the Cambrian explosion still constitute a major challenge up till the moment now?
Sure. Yes. The Cambrian explosion was a sudden appearance within geological time of many different body plans in the fossil record. Body plans are things like insects, invertebrates versus vertebrates versus jellyfish, and so on. Different ways of organizing a body. And yes, it continues to be, ever since Darwin, it has been a problem, and it continues to be a problem. As a matter of fact, it's gotten worse because people have narrowed down the time frame in which they think all of this had to appear. And since that time, over 500 million years ago, there haven't been any new basic innovations, nothing as basic as occurred in that time. So it was a big conundrum for Darwin, and it has never been solved. But that seems not to bother many Darwinists. They can go on even with the most severe problems.
So how do they respond to this, Dr. Beyhi? Like, what's their excuse here?
Well, they first of all, most people don't think about it. Second, they concentrate on little things, and every now and again, some small result comes which fits in with Darwinian theory, and they will focus on that. So they really have blinders on, and people in the audience should realize that the great majority of scientists don't think at all about these problems. And if you ask them about the problems with Darwinism, they wouldn't be able to give you an answer, but they will tell you that it's certain that it's true. And it turns out that they believe it so strongly only based on their assumptions.
So they have faith. They have very strong faith.
Yeah, exactly. You have to have more faith to believe in Darwinism than to believe in God, certainly.
So what about different approaches that describe these problems that arise within the Darwinism framework? But what about Evo, for instance, and the way that they see that there was a structure or schema for every animal that appeared in the Cambrian explosion? So we would like to know about their view, and also would like to know your opinion about this, Dr. B.
Well, Evo is a nickname for evolutionary developmental biology. And it's interesting because there was no evolutionary developmental biology 30 or so years ago. But then scientists, when they develop techniques to sequence DNA and look at the genes in DNA, they discovered that different organisms had similar master genes, which kind of act as switches to turn on the building process to build a particular sort of tissue or organ or something like the eye. And so Darwin's theory was surprised that there were these switches and pathways and very intricate controls to regulate the development of different forms. And instead of looking at that, and instead of saying, we didn't predict this, nothing in Darwinism predicted it, they instead focused on the similarities between the genes and says, oh, well, this gene is similar between human and fish, and so therefore they must have come from a common ancestor. And once again, there's no evidence for that, but they focus on the similarities. So now, since these master genes have been discovered, people have proposed that maybe what happens is that the genes might get duplicated, or new controlling switches might be placed near their vicinity to turn them off or on in different tissues at different times. And that's interesting, but there's no evidence that that can work. And in a few tests, these switches more easily break things than they do build something new. Mm-hmm. So, in summary, it's a new system that was not expected by Darwinian theory. Nobody has shown how Darwinian theory could even use these things to develop new structures, but it gives them something new to use with their imagination to presume how things might go. But as far as my view goes, it has no power to build anything beyond what regular Darwinian processes have.
So what about Darwinists? Do they attack the evo, or they support it or ignore it? Is it dangerous for them, or it's just neutral?
I think it's neutral. It's like Darwinism in general, you can weave it into a Darwinian framework, or you can leave it out. There are some Darwinists that support it, some that oppose it. For example, a man named Jerry Coyne, who's a Darwinian biologist, doesn't like it very much at all. But another man named Sean
Carroll?
What's his name? Thank you. Sean Carroll. He is a big fan of it. But at bottom, they're all just trying to explain life without purpose, without intelligence, without any plan. And to some, it seems more promising to go this way or that way. But they're not succeeding, and it all boils down to the same thing, chance.
But what I understood from this, Dr. B, what they are saying, it's like there's sort of like a program built in within all creatures. So it's a contradiction to say it's random, and at the same time, it's built in with the tissues and the genes. Like, it doesn't convince anyone. Yeah,
that's right. If you think that it's a building can be put together by the winds blowing various things together, and then you find that in fact there's a blueprint, and there are foremen, and there are substructures and so on. That does not help your idea that it could be put together by chance.
Sure. Amazing, Dr. B. So there's a very question here, Dr. B, about concerning your new book, Darwin Devolves, that in your recent response, you said that at each and every step, faster and more numerous degradative mutations would compete fiercely with any of the steps dreamed of by the reviewers. You were responding to some of the critics of your book. So can you shed light, what do you mean about degradative mutations that would compete with any idea that any Darwinist dreams of?
Well, yes, my new book talks about how the mutations that break genes can oftentimes be helpful to an organism. That is, by stopping a gene from being on, it can actually help. And it turns out that those mutations that break genes occur much more frequently, faster, much faster than ones that will help to build something. And that's just because there are many more ways to break a complicated system like a gene than there are to build it up. If you think of your computer, it's a whole lot easier to take a hammer and break it by hitting it pretty much anywhere than it is to improve the working of the computer. Suppose that some step comes along which, against all odds, does improve a gene, makes it stronger or able to do something it couldn't do. Well, what I meant by that passage that you read is that the next step, though, after that helpful one, that constructive one, degradative mutations will again come along. And if there's any gene that could be broken to benefit this new situation where it has that constructive change, they'll zoom in faster than any other constructive one. So it reminds me of a story I heard about shipbuilding, that in the 1700s in England, the shipbuilders would be trying to build wooden ships, but mold would grow on the beams faster than they could complete the ship. And so they would try to build it, but then they'd have to tear it down and put it back together again. So these degradative mutations come along so fast that you wouldn't be able to build some complete new system.
So can we deduce from that it's impossible for a species to change to another species, like within this framework?
Okay, that's a good question. You have to be kind of careful with your terminology, because in biology, the classification systems is that species is the lowest designation. It's like two species of finches. They're both finches, but they have, maybe one has a little bit bigger beak or a little bit of color behind its head or something. And but other people use species to mean rather major differences, like what I would call the family: cats and dogs and bears and whales and so on. I think I write in the new book that evolution can produce new species, those new little tiny changes, because species means that two groups of an organism cannot breed with each other to produce offspring. So they lose the ability to interbreed with each other. So, for example, in Africa, there are species of mosquitoes that a large piece of their DNA has been flipped around. And because of that, when they try to mate, their DNA can't line up like it needs to produce a viable organism. So they would be two new species, but they haven't produced anything new. All they've done is lose the ability to breed with each other. So I think evolution can produce things like that, but they can't produce differences that are on the order of, say, dogs versus cats. What is the biological level of family? So as I write in the book, I think at the level of family, one needs more information that mind would have to instill into the organism.
Mhm.
But, you know, random changes, accidents can affect how an organism looks, but only at the very superficial level.
Thank you for this excellent explanation, Dr. B. That's really amazing. So what about also the opposite argument? Like, what's the positive argument of the Darwinists when it comes to the differences between, let's say, cats and dogs and so on? Do they have something positive to say about it?
No. The differences in organisms at the family level or even at higher levels, it's not known what produces a difference. They will see very similar situations at the molecular and cellular level between cats and dogs and even birds and so on. So nobody knows how such differences would be produced.
Mhm.
But my idea of having the line at the level of family, that is, design was needed down to the level of family, but Darwinian processes can produce species and genera. That predicts that when we do figure out what's the difference between families, cats and dogs and so on, then we'll see that it is that it's sufficient information to be beyond Darwinian control, that it'll be beyond the edge of evolution.
So what about the fossil record? Did they have any fossil record to depend on that proves that there can be changes from one family to another?
Well, the fossil record doesn't prove much of anything because it's just, you know, bones or impressions or things, and there's no description of what happens written into the rock next to it. But it is a problem for Darwin's theory because Darwin's theory would predict a gradual change of one sort of organism into another. And as you mentioned, the overwhelming story of not just the Cambrian explosion, but all the fossil record is this sudden appearance of major groups of organisms. Even, you know, cats and dogs and whales and so on, they appear over a really constricted time period. But there's no indication, the fossil record doesn't indicate how a new kind of organism appeared, or it doesn't tell you any details beyond when this thing appeared. If you take the radioactive dating, say, as an indication, and what the organism looked like or part of it looked like.
But
So
Dr. B, like, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but 99% of like all the animals went extinct. How can we respond? They always say that we had mass extinctions, like 99% of what was on Earth is not now existing. So, well,
so what does one conclude from that? That's the big question. Well, when you want to build something, sometimes you have to clear away a lot, clear away a landscape and so on, and to have space to make something new. Yeah, many people say, you know, God would never have, you know, made species and then gotten rid of them, but I never saw the reasoning behind that. That seems to say that if you make a species, you've got to keep it there forever. That doesn't
that's weird.
You know, follow. Yeah, right. And you know, more than 99% of people who have ever lived have died too. So, you know, why not species as well? I don't see that as an objection to design.
Amazing. So that was my point. Was to be that they say 99% went extinct, and we have to see the fossil record rife with all of the different you can say links between different families and species and kingdoms, but we don't see that.
That's correct. I'm a biochemist, not a paleontologist, but from what I read, That's right. At best, people see maybe some occasional ambiguous fossil that looks like it might be a link between two groups. But when you're thinking about massive changes, like starting with a mouse and in the 60 million years ago, and it's supposed to give rise to whales and to bats and to cattle and to, all mammals, you would expect, millions and millions and millions of transitional fossils, all sorts of gradations. And many of them should have been stable. There's no reason for them just to continue to evolve until they hit upon a plan for a bat, say, and then stop. Many of the intermediates, the supposed intermediates, should have stuck around for a while. And yet you don't see that. So it's completely contrary to what you would expect from a Darwinian view.
But there are responses, Dr. B. They say Lucy and Artie and all of these discovered like fossils. They prove that there's a link between human beings and higher apes. So they have the proof now. It's the end. Checkmate.
Of course, having a fossil doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that it descended from the previous fossil that you found, or that it gave rise to the next fossil that you found, or that if it did, that it did so by Darwin's mechanism of random mutation and natural selection. And if you're trying to get from an ape-like creature to a human-like creature, you would expect to need, large, very large numbers of subtle, tiny changes, allowing an organism to stand up and to think and to speak and so on. You need many, many more transitional types than even the most ardent Darwinist sees in the fossil record. So, the other side, I think, is trying to mislead people into thinking that the evidence is stronger for their point of view than it is, and anything that sort of supports what they want you to conclude, they'll stress that, they'll point to that and pound the table, and but people shouldn't get too impressed by that.
That's amazing, Dr. B. Thank you. We have a very important question, and that's why I'm going to read it, and I would like you to kindly explain it to us, Dr. B. That you have something interesting about the research on the problem of waiting time of mutation, such as your responses to Dorett and Smith. So additionally, there are other researches that shows that natural selection may fail to optimize factors such as mutation rates, genetic drift, or allele frequency, etc. So accordingly, can natural selection be the enemy of evolution?
Well, if the requirement for the correct mutation gets to be even a little bit harder than the most basic kind, if instead of one change to help an organism, suppose you needed two changes to make something that would help an organism. You needed there's a latch. Suppose you needed something for the latch to hook onto the door with, and something for it to attach to keep the door closed. If you need two things in evolution, it makes it much, 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 much more difficult than just one, because it's kind of like winning the lottery. If you need to match one number, that's hard, but if you need to match two numbers, that's exponentially more difficult. Three, and you're pretty much don't have much of a chance. I pointed this out in an article with a man named David Snoke a while back, and we showed that, in fact, natural selection and random mutation would not be expected to be able to make even a very simple cooperative mutation. And a man named Richard Durrett, he wrote an article disputing it, but even he admitted that it would take much, much longer than the time available to have such a mutation appear in a line leading to human beings, large creatures like ourselves. And so this is a problem that's known, that if you need two mutations, it quickly becomes very difficult for Darwin's mechanism to work. So I don't think much of anything could be produced by this mechanism.
Mm-hmm. So we can say that natural selection within this case, it's going to like be working on different things at the same time, and like inanimate thing or something that doesn't have intelligence cannot work on this complexity to change all of these things together.
Well, yes, that's right. There's many different things in the genome of a person or an animal or a plant. There are tens of thousands of genes and lots of control regions and so on. And if you need something in particular to change, suppose something changes to help an organism, but in order to help it more, maybe something completely unrelated changes, then something other unrelated. There's no way to add them up to give a coherent machine-like, say, system. And yet, the cell is packed with molecular machines. In my book, I kind of make an analogy, that natural selection is like a pack rat. These rats that go out and they pick up shiny things to make their nest, and they bring it back and put it in their nest, and then they go out and find some other shiny thing and bring it back. But the shiny things aren't adding up to a machine. They're not matched to each other. They don't make anything new. They're just independent things.
It's amazing, that's amazing. We don't want to be a burden to you, Dr. B, so we'd like to end by a question that I always think about. Do you see that we, as anyone who is working in intelligent design movement, who wants to, let's say, refute Darwinism from a scientific view, do you think that the cooperation is lacking? It's not doing its job. It still needs more work to do, let's say, paper to be published, money to be spent, more work, more coordination between different things, let's say, as you said, paleontology and biochemistry, and physiology, all of these things together to come up with a very strong edifice of scientific proof, to be a positive, strong arguments against the Darwinism.
Okay, that's a good question. And my answer is a firm no. We don't need any more proof.
Sure.
We have an abundance of evidence right now that anybody with an open mind could easily see that Darwinian evolution just cannot work. As a matter of fact, I think that was apparent 50 years ago or more when scientists first discovered the DNA and the genetic code and molecular machinery. And it was obvious back then, but there was kind of an inertia in the scientific field that they just kept with the old idea, and they didn't want Darwinism to be false, and they don't want design to be true. But we don't need any more evidence. Darwinism is dead. But because there are such strong philosophical and religious overtones, then scientists in particular, don't want to admit that.
That's amazing, Dr. Michael. As a last word, we would like to hear from you. What's your feelings about having two interviews the first time to have an interview with an Arab, or with Muslim people. So what's your thoughts?
Now I'm an old hand at it. Now I'm a frequent visitor here.
You're
That's
always
great.
welcome.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Beyhi. It's a pleasure, and we always benefit from your work. God bless you.
Good. Thank you very much.